Hello guys, welcome back to Basketball Fan, and today we're diving straight into a conversation that has quietly turned into one of the most talked about topics around the league right now. Because Sophie Cunningham just dropped a podcast episode that has people reacting in every possible way, and not in a calm or measured way either. I'm talking about fans clipping seconds of audio, zooming into tone, body language, wording, trying to decode meaning out of every pause and every sentence, and honestly, some of the reactions feel a little overcooked, especially the chatter around Raven Johnson where people are convinced there's some massive storyline brewing, some kind of exaggerated love fest narrative that really isn't even the core issue here. And that's where things start to get a bit off track, because while that's the flashy angle people want to latch onto, it's not the real headline, not even close. The real story, the one that actually matters, is Sophie Cunningham being completely real, completely transparent, and honestly a bit frustrated when talking about her contract situation. And if you're watching this on Basketball Fan, you already know we're not here for surface-level takes. We're here to actually break down what's going on beneath the noise, because when an athlete speaks this openly, especially in a league where messaging is often polished and controlled, you should probably pay attention instead of twisting it into something else. And the first thing that stands out is that she didn't sugarcoat anything. There was no PR filter, no carefully crafted wording to avoid stepping on toes. It was direct, it was honest, and yeah, there was frustration there. And not the kind of frustration that feels dramatic or forced, but the kind that builds over time when you know your value, when you've put in the work, when you've delivered in moments that actually matter. And then you look around and things don't quite add up the way you expected, and to really understand that, you have to look at timing, because timing in professional sports, especially in a league like the WNBA, can make or break your financial trajectory. It's not just about how good you are, it's about when you peak. When you're healthy, when you're negotiating, when the market shifts, and for Sophie Cunningham, the timing couldn't have been worse, because right when she was building momentum, right when she was positioning herself for what could have been a significantly bigger payday, an injury hits, and that's not just a physical setback, that's leverage disappearing in real time, that's negotiations shifting before they even fully begin, and she acknowledged that, which is important, because it shows awareness. It shows she understands the business side of the game, and that's something fans sometimes overlook. Athletes aren't just playing, they're constantly navigating contracts, value, perception, and opportunity, and when one piece of that puzzle falls out of place, everything changes, and yet even with that context, you still have to look at the broader picture, because beyond the injury, there's another layer here that people don't always want to address directly. And that's the inconsistency across contracts in the league, because let's be honest, when you scan through different deals, there are moments where you pause and think, wait, how does that make sense? How does this player get that number while another player with comparable or even stronger production is sitting at a different level? And that's not an attack on anyone. That's just reality in a growing league where structures are still evolving, and players notice that. They absolutely notice that. Because at the end of the day, this is a business, and no matter how much passion, love, and dedication is involved, numbers still matter, value still matters, and perception still matters. And that brings us back to Sophie Cunningham's performance, because if you're going to talk about contracts, you have to talk about production. And when you do that, one stretch stands out more than anything else, that mid-season run from mid-July to mid-August, where she didn't just play well, she caught fire in a way that completely shifted the dynamic of her team. And we're not talking about a couple of solid games here and there. We're talking about sustained, high-level production that forced defenses to adjust, that created spacing, that changed outcomes. And if you watched those games, you already know what we're talking about on Basketball Fan, because this wasn't subtle. This was dominant shooting, especially from beyond the arc, where she was hitting threes at percentages that don't even feel real over an extended period. We're talking 60%, 70%, even pushing 80% in certain games, and that's not just good, that's game-changing. That's the kind of performance that can carry a team through rough stretches, and that's exactly what happened. Because at that point in the season, injuries were stacking up, rotations were unstable, consistency was hard to find, And in the middle of all that, she stepped up and delivered. And that's where impact becomes the key word, because yes, availability matters. Being on the court matters, but impact, real impact in critical moments, that's what defines value. That's what shifts seasons, and without that run, it's completely fair to question whether her team even makes the playoffs. That's how significant it was. And yet when the season wraps up and conversations move forward, it feels like that stretch didn't get the level of recognition it deserved. And that's where frustration starts to build, because if you're a player and you know what you contributed, you know the games you influenced, you know the moments where you carried the load, and then you look at your contract situation and it doesn't reflect that in the way you expected, you're going to have questions, you're going to reassess, and you're going to speak on it. And that's exactly what Sophie Cunningham did, and the surprising part isn't that she spoke about it. The surprising part is that people are acting shocked that she did, because this is what happens when performance and compensation feel misaligned, especially in a league that's still growing, still adjusting, still finding its financial footing, and that brings us to the actual numbers, because context matters. And her current deal sits at a one-year contract worth $665,000 guaranteed. And when you hear that, depending on your perspective, you might think that sounds solid. Or you might think that doesn't fully match the level of impact we just talked about. And that's the conversation. That's the real conversation that should be happening instead of getting distracted by side narratives, because when she was asked directly about the contract, whether it was better than she expected given all the recent changes in structure and money across the league, her response was simple and immediate, nope, and that one word carries a lot more weight than people might realize, because it tells you everything you need to know about how she views the situation. It tells you that from her perspective, this wasn't a win. It wasn't a moment of satisfaction. It was more of a compromise shaped by circumstances, and again, that circles back to timing, to injury, to market dynamics, to how quickly things can shift in professional sports. And on Basketball Fan, we always emphasize looking at the full picture, because it's easy to react to a clip. It's easy to build a narrative around a headline, but when you actually break it down, when you connect performance, timing, contracts, and league structure, you start to see why this situation feels the way it does, and why her comments weren't random or emotional outbursts. They were grounded in experience, in production, and in understanding of the business and moving forward. This becomes something to watch, not just for her, but for the league as a whole, because as the WNBA continues to grow, as revenue increases, as visibility expands, these kinds of conversations are going to become more common. Players are going to speak more openly about value, about fairness, about timing, and that's part of evolution. That's part of a league finding its balance. And for fans watching on Basketball Fan, it's important to stay grounded in that reality. To recognize that behind every contract discussion is a combination of performance, timing, and circumstance, and in Sophie Cunningham's case, all three of those factors collided in a way that left her feeling like things could have been different, and honestly, that's a perspective that deserves to be understood rather than dismissed, because when you strip away the noise, the reactions, and the overanalysis, what you're left with is a player who delivered at a high level, who faced unfortunate timing with injury, and who is now navigating the business side of the sport with a clear and honest voice. And whether you agree with her or not, that honesty is something that adds value to the conversation, because it pushes the league forward, it creates dialogue. And it reminds everyone that behind every stat line and every contract number is a real story shaped by moments that don't always show up in headlines. And that's exactly why we're talking about it here today on Basketball Fan. Because this isn't just about one player or one contract. It's about understanding how all the pieces fit together in a league that's still writing its future in real time. Welcome back to Basketball Fan. And if you've been following the conversation around Sophie Cunningham lately, then you already know things have gotten a little louder, a little more layered, and honestly a lot more interesting than people expected. Because what started as a simple podcast appearance has turned into a full-blown discussion about contracts, value, timing, perception, and the reality of how professional sports actually operate behind the scenes, and the part that really stands out, if you're actually listening instead of reacting, is just how honest she was about everything, because when she was asked directly about her contract situation, there was no attempt to dress it up, no attempt to make it sound better than it was. Just a straightforward, almost blunt acknowledgement that no, it wasn't what she had hoped for, and that kind of honesty tends to make people uncomfortable, especially in a space where athletes are often expected to smile, nod, and present everything, as if it worked out perfectly. But that's not what happened here, and that's exactly why this moment matters, because she went deeper, she explained the context, and once you actually hear her out, the frustration starts to make a lot more sense. Because she pointed to something that doesn't always get enough attention, and that's visibility, not in the social media sense, but in the literal sense of being seen by decision makers, because she talked about coming off an injury, being fully cleared medically, having all the documentation, all the numbers, all the confirmation that she was ready to go, but not actually getting in front of teams the way she needed to, and that creates doubt, whether it's fair or not, because from a team's perspective, if they don't physically see you perform, if they don't see you move, compete, and operate at full speed, there's always going to be that lingering question of, are you really back? And that uncertainty directly impacts negotiations. And she admitted that was frustrating, not in a dramatic way, but in a very real, grounded way, because from her perspective, she knows how she feels, she knows what she can do, and she even made it clear that if she wasn't feeling right, if there was hesitation, if there was something off, she would have said it, because she's at a point in her career where honesty matters more than image, winning matters more than ego, and that's a key detail that a lot of people gloss over, because when she says she just wants to win, that's not a cliche, that's a mindset, that's a shift that happens when a player has been in the league long enough to understand what actually matters, and she even acknowledged that while she understands the business side of things, she feels wired a little differently, meaning she's not approaching this purely from a financial perspective. She's balancing that with competitiveness, with the desire to be in the right situation to compete at the highest level, and that dual mindset is where things get complicated. Because on one hand, you're evaluating your contract, your worth, your opportunities, and on the other hand, you're thinking about fit, about winning, about where you can actually make an impact that leads to something bigger than individual success. And she didn't shy away from that complexity. She leaned into it, even calling the situation a wake-up call, something that lit a fire under her, something that pushed her to not get comfortable, and that's another layer people should be paying attention to, because moments like this can either discourage a player or motivate them, and based on everything she said, this clearly falls into the second category, because she talked about feeling good physically, shooting the ball well, being in a strong mental space, and when you combine that with the kind of motivation that comes from feeling undervalued, that can be a dangerous combination in the best possible way for her performance moving forward. And on Basketball Fan, that's the kind of detail we focus on, because it's not just about what was said, it's about what it leads to, and at the same time, it's important to acknowledge the reality she pointed out, which is that coming off an MCL injury does matter. It affects leverage. It affects timing. It affects what teams are willing to offer, and ignoring that would be dishonest, because teams operate with risk assessment in mind. They're not just paying for what you did, they're projecting what you will do, and if there's any uncertainty in that projection, it changes the equation. So when people react to her comments as if she's just complaining without context, they're missing a huge part of the story, because she's not denying the reality of her situation. She's acknowledging it while also expressing that she believes her value is higher, and those two things can exist at the same time, and that's where I think a lot of the reactions have gone off track, because instead of understanding that balance, some people have jumped straight to criticism, as if she's not allowed to feel that way, and that doesn't really make sense, because in any professional setting, if you believe your value exceeds your compensation, you're going to question it. You're going to evaluate it, and you're probably going to talk about it, and that doesn't make you ungrateful, it makes you aware, and when you zoom out even further, this isn't just about one player, this is about how value is perceived across the league. Because Sophie Cunningham isn't just a name on a roster, she's a player with visibility, with reach, with a presence that extends beyond the court, and in 2025, she was one of the most searched female athletes on Google, which tells you something about her profile. Because that kind of visibility doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from performance, personality, marketability, and consistency in being part of the conversation, and that matters when you're evaluating total value. Because contracts aren't just about box scores anymore, they're about brand, about audience, about what a player brings to the league as a whole, and she even mentioned having other opportunities, which is another key point. Because leverage doesn't always come from within the league. Sometimes it comes from what you can do outside of it, whether that's endorsements, media roles, or other ventures, and she's already stepping into that space, doing media work, calling games, being involved in coverage. And that creates additional layers to her career that go beyond her on-court role. So when she looks at her contract, she's not just thinking about points per game or shooting percentages. She's thinking about the full picture, and that's exactly how modern athletes approach their careers. And that brings us to another reality that was mentioned, which is what happens next. Because if things don't align this season, if the team doesn't win, if the situation doesn't feel right, there's a strong possibility she moves on. And that's not dramatic, that's business. Because at that point, you evaluate where the best combination of money and opportunity exists, whether that's within the same league, a different role, or even something entirely different. And based on everything we know, she'll have options, because players with her level of visibility and versatility rarely find themselves without opportunities. And then there's the other part of this conversation that has been blown way out of proportion. And that's her comments about Raven Johnson, because she praised her, called her a dog, said she loved what she saw on day one of training camp, and somehow that turned into a whole narrative about team dynamics, chemistry, and underlying meanings that probably aren't even there, because what she said was standard. It was exactly what you'd expect from a veteran talking about a rookie. It was supportive, positive, and professional, and that's where people need to be realistic. Because no veteran is going to come out publicly after the first day of training camp and criticize a rookie. That's not how locker rooms work. That's not how professional environments operate, and the same goes the other way. Rookies aren't going to publicly take shots at established players because there's an understanding of optics, of respect, of maintaining a certain level of professionalism in public, and that doesn't mean everything is perfect behind the scenes. It just means players know how to handle the public side of things, and that's an important distinction, because both things can be true at the same time. You can have professionalism in interviews and still have tension or competition internally. That's part of sports, that's part of any team environment, and it's actually more normal than people think. But what you rarely see is players openly calling each other out in public, because when that happens, it usually leads to bigger issues. Trades, locker room problems, disruptions that teams try to avoid. So when people take a positive quote and treat it as definitive proof that everything is perfect, that's just as inaccurate as assuming there's a problem based on limited moments. And the same logic applies when people bring up other players like Caitlin Clark, because expecting high-level professionals to publicly criticize teammates or coaches is unrealistic. That's not how they operate. There's a level of awareness, composure, and discipline that comes with being at that level, and understanding that helps you interpret these comments more accurately. And when you bring it all back together, when you look at everything Sophie Cunningham said about her contract, her mindset, her priorities, and her perspective, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's fair, it's grounded, and it makes sense, because if you compare production, impact, visibility, and opportunity across the league, you can see why she feels the way she does, and you don't have to agree with her to understand her. And that's the key point here on Basketball Fan, because this isn't about picking sides, it's about breaking down the situation in a way that actually reflects reality. And the reality is that she's a player coming off an injury, navigating a contract that didn't meet her expectations, balancing a desire to win with an understanding of business, building her brand both on and off the court, and positioning herself for whatever comes next. And when you look at it through that lens, the outrage some people are showing doesn't really hold up, because there's nothing shocking about an athlete wanting more, expecting more, or believing they're worth more. That's part of competition. That's part of growth. And that's part of what drives players to elevate their game. And if anything, this situation might end up being a turning point, a moment that fuels her performance moving forward. And if that happens, then this conversation will shift from contract frustration to on-court results very quickly, and that's something worth watching closely as the season unfolds, because if she delivers at the level she believes she can, then the entire narrative changes. And suddenly that one-year deal becomes less of an endpoint and more of a stepping stone to something bigger. And that's why this story isn't over. It's just getting started. So let me know what you think, and if you're rocking with this kind of Real breakdown, make sure you stay locked in with Basketball Fan.